I'm Dan Hilson. I'm the CEO and founder of Energy and the chair of the Charge Together program. Today we have a webinar on leading councils who are leading the transition to electric vehicles, and we're joined by Anthony Weinberg from Waverley, Randwick and Woollahra Councils, Stuart Nesbitt from Moreland City Council, and Peter Nattrass from the City of Adelaide. Local governments leading the charge in this area, both in Australia and around the world, and it's very interesting to hear from these three leading councils on the efforts. So we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we'll start with Anthony.
We mapped emissions spatially and looked at emissions per person and realised that there was a really strong correlation with emissions and car use. You can sort of see the two graphs on the right-hand side look really highly correlated, and that's just because of lack of public transport to those areas and high car use as being a factor. So we know that transport emissions is one of the key drivers of the overall emissions of our area. And when we calculated it, turned out that it was 22% of the emissions for the Eastern Suburbs was transport, so pretty big number. We started delving a bit deeper into it, and we did a survey of our residents to see what they knew about EVs and if they were supportive of EV uptake. And we found, not surprisingly, that they were very keen on EVs, but they saw a lot of barriers to uptake. And 71% of them, out of the 406 respondents, said lack of charging was the number one, followed by price and range. So these sort of statistics mirrored what we'd seen by ClimateWorks and others, and other groups like NRMA as seeing charging availability as a key barrier. Would we ask? If we did do electric vehicles or their electric vehicle charging, or there was better charging infrastructure, would it make a difference? And 78% of people said yes. So really, then we started talking internally about what councils can do and how councils are really an enabler of EV uptake. There's not so much that councils can do on price and range, and they're inherently linked, that the more models that come out, the more competition there is, the price goes down. But in terms of availability of charging infrastructure, that's somewhere where councils can actually play a really big enabling role to, break this chicken and egg cycle of price and range and people just not having the uptake, which isn't driving demand for EVs. So it was a key way that we thought we could insert ourselves into the EV picture and trying to encourage more people to use an EV or to buy an EV. We worked with, this is back in late 2016, we did a bunch of literature reviews and reviews of trials of what had worked around Australia, and also globally. We did a review of all the literature of different EV case studies and trials to see where the successes and failures have been. And it really came up with the key messages were go public, go visible, go level 2 initially, pick really premium spots, don't make them, make it a big hoo-ha as a first instance, and go sort of destination charging, like try and pick areas where people want to spend a lot of time, and let some of the other people look at the super highway sort of stuff and more of the super fast charging. So we ended up over the last 12 months building this network of electric vehicle charging stations. They're level 2 charging stations at sort of 7 key public destinations. We had our launch of the network only 3.5 weeks ago, so they're all pretty new. But it was you can see on the left here, it was a very wet day. And since that time, we've got a fair bit of data of the uptake and what's been happening. But really the philosophy around what we've installed was the dual port level 2 EV chargers. There's a lot of talk about how fast they are and what cars they can accommodate. Basically, for best case scenarios, they can charge 150 kilometers per hour. So you're looking at a decent amount of charge within 2 hours. They are destination charging, so they are, designed to be in places where you are going to spend a couple of hours. They're not sort of your, some of your slower chargers or your super fast chargers. we made sure that they're universally accessible. That is, like, all cars can use them. It's and we are, as of the 1st of July, being charging our residents or users a fee to use them based on their kilowatt hours of usage. So it's a fair and equitable way of using it and making people pay, and it really helped getting that across the line internally with council as well, knowing that there was a, albeit long, business case and payback period that they were going to be able to recoup some money. They are powered by 100% renewable energy as well, which is a key thing. A big barrier for us is waiting actually for the signage to come out for electric vehicle chargers, which RMS only issued about a year ago, and we had to sort of lobby hard for. And then once that sort of happened, it was that really sort of helped facilitate the whole process and get it moving once we had the confidence to know that these spots would be enforced. This is sort of just a bit of a snapshot of our monitoring dashboard that we have through ChargeFox. So ChargeFox are a software provider. They monitor our charging stations, and we get, this is the summary page. You sort of see when they're getting used, who's using them, how much, what the average time is, how many kilowatts, and then we don't have any revenue yet because we hadn't started charging, but we've obviously got cost. So really good way of monitoring it, and a lot of any faults or issues can be addressed remotely by ChargeFox as well. So I know there'll be a lot of questions, but I guess summary of sort of what we've tried to do is, it took a while to get this project up and running, and we were working off a pretty tight budget of around $15,000 per charger. So it actually took us a while to work out how to do it cheaply, and a lot of that involved actually getting electricity supplies from our existing assets. And then the real hard part, I guess, was identifying suitable sites, because parking is such a premium around the eastern suburbs, and it's an issue that's very emotive for a lot of our residents and for all our councillors. So really the internal engagement with the asset owners, the traffic committees, the strategic parking team, all of that really took a long time. We did it across all 3 councils, but it was a process to get everyone to understand, up to speed on what electric vehicles are and where they were headed, that the uptake was, the demand was going to start really picking up towards the end of 2019, we said, and then making sure they were happy with the spots that we were taking away from, regular ICE cars to be able to use, because there's an associated loss of revenue sometimes. We wanted to have 2 parking spots at each of our chargers. We've settled on just having 1 while we look at the utilisation, so that was a good compromise. But we really had to sort of push asset owners and traffic committees to make sure they were really comfortable with what we were doing. We also had to do a bunch of collaboration, and Peter and Stuart were people I'd speak to on the phone regularly and really helped out with sort of designing the project. But there are a whole bunch of other people we were talking to about how to best implement this. And crucially, we really saw the value in good software, not just hardware. We sort of, EV chargers are a glorified PowerPoint in many respects. It's really the software behind it, and as the brains that really makes or breaks a good system. And also choosing a provider that is going to be able to repair it if it breaks or gets vandalized, can address the software bugs or updates, is going to be on the end of the line. If someone calls up at 10 o'clock at night and doesn't know how to use the charger, who's that going to go to? So all of those things were really big considerations for us. But yeah, the rewards are numerous, and I guess we all know the benefits of EVs in terms of reducing noise and pollution. We really want to increase access to charging and provide the confidence for someone to buy an EV. And even if the spots aren't being used, it's almost that's the carrot that we're dangling in front of people next time they look to purchase a car, that they could get that spot. We have noticed in just some of the preliminary data that we're getting people from out of town, and it's bringing, people from not our area in. So there's a tourism component to that, which was another key sort of little selling point, which helped get the project over the line. And I guess the other thing we've really tapped into, if many of the people listening are from councils, is the whole idea of, which is very popular amongst federal government, and there's lots of work happening around smart cities and sort of basically making, you know, some of our technology more accessible and creating market transformation so other providers can come in and introduce technology into our regions that's going to make life easier for everyone else. So what's coming up next? We've still got another couple of installations to finish off. We are going to spend a bit more time engaging and promoting our network to EV drivers in the local area, and more broadly, I guess we're still focused on our fleet and car share as next targets, with more affordable models coming off the production line and being introduced to Australia. And really, in terms of charging, now that we've done a bit of a public network, we're looking to support non-private, non-public EV chargers in shopping centres and clubs, and seeing, okay, well, how can they supplement what we've done and vice versa? Because from a user's point of view, it doesn't matter who owns them. They just, it's just about the density of chargers within your area, and that's really going to support greater uptake, we think. We've also really worked hard on making sure that new developments in our planning requirements have the capacity for EVs to be charged in their basements. So we're talking here about apartment blocks really that are popping up all over the place, and making sure there's enough electrical capacity for 20% of lot owners to be able to charge simultaneously, and that there's EV charging in visitors' parkings and things like that. So these developments are future-proof. And finally, I think we're going to really not in the next year, but beyond that, we're really going to have to work on these medium to high density residential areas, because we've got 55% of people living in apartments in our area. How do we support them to own EVs and to put public charging stations in little car park areas and along the street to allow them to have the confidence to purchase an EV? So we'll be having more of a hotspot approach around medium to high density residential areas. So that's it. Thank you, guys.
No problem. Thank you very much for your time. And what we'll do is, as I said, we'll keep going. We'll ask questions at the end. So I might cut straight over to Peter, perhaps. So Peter, if you want to jump on and get your sharing ready.
Yep.
We can see that. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. And you can hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so City of Adelaide, I'll just make it clear, I suppose, as to our council area is not a large council area. It's pretty consistent with other capital cities. It's quite a tight municipal boundary. And you can see by that slide, we've got a predominantly residential area in the north, separated by parklands to the main CBD. So Adelaide's surrounded by the Adelaide parklands. So that's our council area. So it's not a huge area, but it is over 20% of the state's gross regional product. And for people that've been to Adelaide, it's got its mix of high density living as well as commercial office buildings and retail. So the City of Adelaide has an ambition to be one of the world's first carbon neutral cities. And so we've now for over a decade been preparing annual or biannual city community inventories. And there's a consistent pattern which shows that because of growing intensity of activity in the city, so our economy, the city economy grew by, I think, greater than 36% in that 10-year period from 2007 to 2017. We've got more workers in the city, which means more transport emissions. We've got a massive influx of renewable generation to the state. So as the carbon intensity of the grid drops, then and the level of activity in the city increases, then transport emissions increase as a percentage of overall emissions. but they are actually increasing in absolute terms as well. So the City of Adelaide, knows that it needs to tackle its transport emissions, and that's why it's certainly made it a key focus area. So 76% of journeys we calculate are light vehicle, and that fits very well into this category of passenger vehicles that we expect to be electrified over the next, rapidly electrified over the next 5 to 10 years. The City of Adelaide strategic plan drives all of this. So it's a few years old now. We're just starting a process to prepare a new one with our new council that was came in last year. But there's an action in there that is to provide a range of incentives, basically to encourage the uptake of electric vehicles. So its keyword is range, so it's not a singular, it's coming at it from multiple angles. And that's certainly been the drive of the past council, and also the new council has continued that push as well. And I'll come back to that more soon. In terms of the number of charges that we've got, the City of Adelaide started over, like many other councils, 10 years ago. We put in our first charges. We just had 2 15 amp charges, like just power points, but we also had 2 charge point units that we also installed. And then there was a fair drought between those charges and the current batch of charges that we've finished installing. So now we have 42 charges that are under the council's operation in the city. And our focus is very much around decarbonise, not demonise the car. Adelaide certainly has a very car-focused culture, and like many Australian cities and towns. And so it's not productive to, our experience has not been productive to sort of look at it and talk down the car. So what we've chosen to do is to pursue that global megatrend of electrification coming through, to change the language that we use in our approach. And this dates back now about 3 or 4 years to really move into this electrification. So 42 stations. As I mentioned, we've got the original 2 15 amp wall plugs, which was important to retain for some of our really early adopters and modifiers. They still come and use those chargers. They're free, but the significant majority of our chargers are the same as what Anthony just mentioned. They're Schneider 22 kilowatt 3-phase chargers. We have importantly split them, I suppose, to on-street, off-street, and there's 30 which are off-street, and then 8 that are on-street. Importantly, as we've gone through, we've made sure that we've also put in chargers into accessible bays, rather than just put them into the normal parking bays. And then we have 2 50 kilowatt chargers. As per Anthony's experience, it was really important, and the City of Adelaide certainly has a strong position on the need for fees to be applied with electric vehicle charging services. And the reason for that is government moving into this sector is that we can't sustain or grow the network at the rate that the community is going to need, and therefore by not applying fees, potentially it is introducing a new barrier for industry and the business models. If we're giving it away for free, that's a problem. You'll see that we do have the first hour free on our charges. That's to align with a couple of the boom gates in our off-street car parks. And that was also as setting an incentive in that first hour. But thereafter, we move into charging on a per kilowatt hour basis with a minimum fee of $1 after 1 hour. The 50 kilowatt DC charges there's nothing free, and that's 30 cents a kilowatt hour. We identified very early when we were scoping up the project the need to look at alternatives to RFID cards, because just the convenience. We wanted a customer experience, which was that people would be able to use a single card to pay at the boom gates as they entered our car parks, but also to then activate our charges. That was the key test, I suppose, when we went to the market, was seeking a payment option in this area, and that's where JetCharge, ChargeFox were able to work up a solution. This has been a really important aspect. We've found that everyone wants to pay with card, naturally, but there's also people who want to be anonymous. They don't want to, they're potentially as early adopters of technology, potentially with higher disposable income. They are conscious of their privacy, and they actually show an interest in not actually appearing on the radar too much, noting that their credit card are being traced anyway, but they don't want someone else knowing further details about them. So this option is popular. So just stepping through a few photos of our installations, we chose to install predominantly into our off-street car parks. So council owns several public multi-deck car parks. The decision to go into the car parks where they're in the prime locations that were popular, convenient to retail, central markets, these sort of facilities. So 30 into those, but also to pursue fleets. Importantly, the City of Adelaide's approach is to lead, but ensure that we are setting an example for others to follow, and creating that environment, testing and demonstrating what's possible and the like, and then sharing our knowledge freely. So here we have the Franklin Street hub with our former Lord Mayor when it was opened, and that car parking space was a joint project with Tesla, and again, all of our bays are universal in making sure that we're allowing maximum number of vehicles to access them. So all of our bays are either Type 2 socket, or they are Type 1 tethered, Type 2 tethered, or CHAdeMO. So maximising the range of vehicles. The next site, these are just on street. So on street, we our construction partner was SA Power Networks. Really a useful and highly productive relationship with them. Again, all of these charging stations that the city have rolled out has been an excellent grant-funded opportunity with the Government of South Australia. It's been an excellent partnership there to actually fund these. And SA Power Networks were excellent because they know their capacity of their local network. Really important that when you're looking at on-street charging points is actually know what capacity, what the network is, where they actually think they can go, where they've got capacity, just to avoid any surprises with augmentation, charges. Really important that you speak to the network about what's possible. This is the Adelaide Central Market, and this one has a system on it that is just demand management, so lights and that which we're just experimenting with to try and have a variable allocation of spaces. So when the light shows orange, it's electric vehicles only. When it's green, it's all vehicles. And that's, again, just to reflect that when the car park gets really full, if there's not currently demand for these bays, then people will naturally park in them. And so we're just responding to that with this system, just going through the validation testing process with it to see how effective it is at different times of day. So what's the opportunity from the City of Adelaide? So in the City of Adelaide, we really turn our mind now to the other car park operators within the city, because certainly the research is about fleets, being a really important group to target and support with incentives. And we're finding that fleets are finding other car parking operators as there's a reluctance to install infrastructure, or they don't know how to start the conversation. So the City of Adelaide, our analysis is there's at least 26,600 off-street multi-deck car parking bays, plus the private bays in like apartment buildings and office buildings. And then there's a whole range of sort of temporary single story, like warehouse conversions. Now, there's 2 million square metres of office space in the city that we've chased for over a decade for energy efficiency. Haven't even really looked at multi-storey car parks. 700,000 square metres of multi-deck car park. We certainly see that as an area for focus, given that these car park operators, you know, that 82% of those bays are controlled by 6 owners and operators. So there's a high concentration of these parking facilities. And so therefore it's a real challenge in terms of corporations and businesses and commuters who are wanting to have an EV, drive it into the city, or have it garaged overnight in the city. If they can't get charging facilities, they're not going to take up EVs, unless, of course, there's you know, very high speed charges elsewhere. But they want the convenience, knowing that most charging would normally occur at home, but the convenience of having all of their billing done through the car park removes that employer problem of how do I you know, reimburse people. So yeah, we see that these car parks are a really important opportunity for energy efficiency upgrades, but also technology and repositioning these assets. Our view is that with 6 owners with 700 and something thousand square metres of multi-deck car park, there's a need to support that group for them to actually move together to have the services that our community needs more broadly. Certainly the work that Daniel did in South Australia, the EV Energy's work, that found that fleet buyers are more rational and likely to respond to more strongly to incentives than private buyers. And so, and that's because they're responding to that total cost of ownership. And with 2017, 52% of Australian vehicles new vehicles sold into fleets. Again, another reason for us to be looking at fleets. So when we've done some analysis on those car parks, looked at who's occupying them, we think that there's about 10% of those bays are occupied by permanent reserve fleet cars. So there's a group there of people who have an ongoing, potentially longer term relationship with car parks. So 2,660 say bays. Now, if we run some scenarios of uptake, if you have come 2025, noting fleets will most likely be early adopters of these vehicles, that's the assumption. If you have 25% of those 2,660 bays with an electric vehicle in it, that's 666 charges. And you can see there 50, 1,300, 75%, you know, nearly 2,000 charges that the city might need. Now, that's a large number of charges, but you can see that if we're not moving proactively to encourage the community into that area, then there's going to be a real disconnect between service and driver needs. Hence why just Tuesday night, our council endorsed an update to our 2015 Sustainability Incentive Scheme. So we first introduced battery energy storage incentives in 2015, as well as electric vehicle charging incentives. And so we've just updated them. So now we're recognising, one-way and two-way, or unidirectional and bidirectional charging. This is just reflecting in South Australia, the opportunity that we perceive, which is with huge amounts of renewables during the middle of the day, solar penetration on residential households, what we call the duck curve, many of you are probably familiar with, where it's a hollowing out of the energy market in the middle of the day due to like rooftop solar. There's a big push to get controlled loads, some more demand into the middle of the day, and certainly that's reflected in the availability of the controlled load tariffs, which are half the price of normal tariffs. And so we're really trying to position to support innovation and entrepreneurialism in the City of Adelaide. So we've got 50% to $1,000 for 7 to 50 kilowatt charges. That's what we've had previously. We just upped it from 5 to 7 as a minimum. And then we've got the $5,000 per 50 kilowatt charger. But importantly, we have these new bidirectional incentives. which is 50% to 5,000, and also 20% to 10,000 for an energy management system that can enable multiple vehicle to grid charges to come into be basically a virtual power plant or battery. Now, where we see the opportunity there is when we talk with fleets are looking for additional revenue streams to offset the potential risks of residual values and potentially higher cost up front. And so they're interested in knowing, where they might be able to get some offsets. The city has the highest level of energy security in the state. And so our lights go out last. And therefore we see that there's a role the city can play to provide services to the broader community if it actually has some storage capacity. And so there's money to be made in normal periods, but you can get up to the $14,500 a megawatt hour, in which case it's very profitable for those events. For fleets in the garage between 5 and 9 o'clock at night, they can easily, we're just calling for entrepreneurs really and app developers and energy retailers to work together to use vehicle to grid to create solutions that then can monetize the opportunity of garage to vehicles while people are visiting or the light city. Bikes, don't forget other forms of mobility, e-bikes, scooters, 50% to 250, but also controlled load, we've got 50% to 500, which just covers some of the electrical work that's required just to redirect pumps, underfloor heating, but electric vehicle chargers are also eligible for that. So that's the controlled load one is really focused towards our residential sector, as the council discontinued the residential battery storage rebate, maintained the commercial rebate, and that reflects the state government's home battery scheme, which is fantastic. So that scheme therefore positions those households to be able to access that low cost electricity and contribute to the state's grid stability and also accelerate the uptake of renewables by creating demand in the middle of the day. And that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Very, very interesting. And yeah, we'll go straight over to Stuart. So if you want to stop your sharing, and Stuart, if you want to jump on. And again, we'll take some questions at the end, but that's fascinating. Thank you. We can see a screen. Stuart, we can't quite hear you yet.
Yeah, just unmuting. Can you hear me now?
Yep, great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Daniel. I'll brush through this, and my apologies in advance for probably a lot of people that are online that have seen this presentation. I'm very much into recycling, so that's what this is all about. So essentially, what I'm talking about today is Moreland's transition to zero emissions in its fleet, but obviously that covers off on our rolling out of charging infrastructure to encourage community uptake of electric vehicles. And essentially, the key criteria are the usual suspects, reduce the emissions from fleet operations, acknowledging climate change and the combustion of fossil fuel, and also recognising the inefficiencies associated with continued use of internal combustion engines, which are extremely inefficient ways of converting energy, and progressively moving renewable energy into the fleet fuel space. And obviously creating a blueprint for council to move forward to a zero emissions fleet operations. Starting point for us was involvement in the Victorian government's EV trial back in 2012. It was a very successful participation. We had an instant leave for about 6 months, which was really popular with staff. What we actually did was conducted an internal review, like a survey. I sort of dangled a carrot with a few prizes to encourage people to fill in a pre and a post test drive survey of that electric vehicle. And it was a really interesting sort of feedback from people that had never envisaged or even considered driving an electric vehicle, and then after they did, we provided that report to the Victorian government to include in their final report as well. So it was very interesting, turnaround from a lot of people. That was the common theme in that study. That followed very closely with council commissioning an electric vehicle feasibility study. Now, this study is actually getting very dated now. We did that in 2014, and it's available for anybody to actually download off our website. And and Pitt and Sherry delivered it for us. And of course, it was a very different space back in 2014 to what it is now. This side-by-side comparison was an interesting one. It was criteria that I put in their brief, because we were already running a Nissan Leaf in our fleet for over 18 months at that stage, and we were, the fleet was heavy on hybrid vehicles, particularly the hybrid Camry. And the statement down the bottom there pretty much sums it up, but it's an important thing to remember, because this comes up in a lot of conversations now, is that back in the day, we were talking about a 30% difference in the price of those two cars to us. But of course, now with this introduction of second generation electric vehicles with much larger batteries, and this is an important point to make, is that generally speaking, the price of an electric vehicle at the moment, with the lack of incentive schemes that we've got at the moment, is pretty much in direct proportion to the size of the battery. So what we're seeing now with these second generation vehicles with bigger batteries is that is around about a 50% difference between equivalent vehicles now. So it was something came up in a webinar, a similar sort of a webinar just recently, and colleague Indy from the City of Yarra had done some cost benefit analysis similar to what we did back in the day. And of course, now with 50% difference between the two, the business case is pretty sketchy. The interesting thing from our point of view is that that didn't really make a lot of difference to us, because essentially what we were doing was transitioning, not irrespective of the economics, but environment was the defining factor over economics. And so we're still sort of pressing ahead with it. So obviously we've been successfully operating EVs in our fleet since 2013. There's a couple there you can see. And then, of course, that led into the council calling for a strategic review of our vehicle policy, which we had Endeavour Environmental deliver for us in 2017, which led to the development of new vehicle policies when we got a snapshot. That photo on the side is an interesting one. I thought I'd throw that in here. At the time that we were doing that review, we were approached by ABMARC, who pretty much do all the testing for state and federal governments on emission standards in Australia. And they were doing a round of testing, and the important thing was that they were asking people with specific vehicles, for late model vehicles, if they would donate vehicles for testing, because of course, LRVW scandal, they're a little bit sceptical of getting them from the manufacturers and wondering what they get. So we donated one of our Colorado diesel utes to fulfill their requirements, and that table extracted from the report that they eventually released is a really interesting one, and it was an eye-opener for us as far as the development of our vehicle policy was concerned. So think of this vehicle as late model. There's nothing wrong with it, but when you see there the figures that were produced on the NOx and hydrocarbons were off the planet, basically, and this is typically what they find with a lot of diesel vehicles. I believe, I stand corrected here, I believe of the 13 vehicles that they tested in that particular year, there was only 1 or 2 that complied with the design criteria the manufacturer intended for them to meet. So that was a bit of an eye-opener there, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's been a bit of a push in Europe to roll back the diesels, where they were pushing them years ago because of their typically lower greenhouse gas emissions by comparison with the petrol. But the NOx is the killer, of course, and that's what they're concerned about. And that led into, as I'll show in a later slide, us banning the purchase of diesel passenger vehicles. Obviously, you don't have a lot of options in light commercial vehicles at this stage, but obviously, as we progress, that should change. So that led into the adoption of a new vehicle policy last year, about 12 months ago. And the key points that came out of that, the most important one, was a zero emissions vehicle purchasing priority. And I'll show you a snapshot that comes out of that in a latter thing. So again, as I said before, the environmental outcomes were the priority over economics. So we didn't ignore economics, but environmental was more important. So the fallback option, if zero emission vehicles aren't available, is a maximum of 100 grams of CO2 per kilometre. And as probably everybody knows in this webinar, that the federal government's had a parliamentary committee looking at the possibility of adopting 105 grams by 2025. So we went with 100 grams now, and to give you an idea of how tough that is, some of the leading hybrids such as a Camry and a Prius station wagon and the newly released hybrid RAV4 would not meet that standard. Also recognition of the higher purchase costs of zero emissions vehicles, and so budgets would need to be calibrated. And that comes back to that original study in Pitt and Sherry, which has changed a little bit, as I said before, with the costs of a comparison of the new vehicles, but essentially saying that you know, there's a business case, albeit a very slim one, and the higher purchase costs will typically be recovered over the total cost of ownership of the vehicle. And then, of course, as I said, you know, diesel passenger vehicles banned. That table down below is extracted straight from the policy, which pretty much just gives the fleet procurement department a bit of a snapshot of what to look for. It's obviously a changing scene all the time. As it talks about down the bottom there, is that vehicle examples will vary. And so as new offerings to the Australian market come on board, they just change it in accordance with that. Now, this is what I said before. This is extracted directly from the new policy that's been adopted by Council, Appendix A, Approved Vehicles and Selection Framework. And as I said before, the environmental outcomes rule over economics in our case. And this was something that was very important for the Council to have included in this policy. And so as you see there, it prioritises the purchase of entry-level zero emissions vehicles in the first instance, irrespective of vehicle value during procurement. Now, there's obviously some wriggle room in that. The paragraph below that talks about a priority of fuel options. And basically, you know, we list fuel options in, you know, 1 to 4 that talk about, you know, battery electric vehicle, fuel cell electric vehicle, hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and so forth. But essentially what that's saying is that if there's various different stage gates that you go through when you're selecting a vehicle for replacement or for additional vehicles in the policy, it goes through. The first stage gate is fit for purpose. For obvious reasons, it's got to be fit for purpose. You're not going to buy a zero emissions vehicle just because of its zero emissions. It needs to fit the purpose. Otherwise, you'll be accused of greenwashing. And of course, the second one is the safety requirements, which is pretty much ANCAP 5 for passenger vehicles and ANCAP 4 for light commercial vehicles. And then, of course, it's saying that just because options 3 and 4, there may be vehicles that meet that secondary framework in terms of the 100 grams of CO2 per kilometre. It basically says if those first 2 stage gates have been met when looking at an appropriate vehicle, then the zero emissions vehicle has to be purchased as a priority. So as a result of the adoption of that policy, the fleet transition's underway. We've basically had 4 EVs in the fleet for probably the last 6 years. But we've just recently added 10 additional EVs, all Hyundai Ioniqs, pretty much the only ones you can buy, which meet that criteria, entry-level zero emissions vehicle. And then, of course, had them all wrapped up in a message to sort of push the case for zero emissions vehicles. You'll notice the little logo on the side of that vehicle is kind of, you know, a promotion, but also celebrating the fact that Moreland is part of the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project. And from the 1st of January this year, all of the electrons for Council's corporate operations, which include all of our charging stations, both private and public, are coming from the Crowlands Wind Farm northwest of Ararat. And we started developing a network of EV charging stations that are owned and operated by the council. We're up to 10 now, but it started with the earlier ones as part of the Victorian government's EV trial, which of course included the installation of the first DC fast charger in Victoria, which was installed in 2013. We've recently updated that to the tritium 50 kilowatt, and of course, the network, as I say now, is 10 free public charging stations. I might just talk about that point and reflect on Peter's discussions previously. We took a different position on charging for the use of our stations, and we've been free from day one. Having said that, we restrict the time that people can be at those stations for each session and we've recently just upgraded our signage to reflect this. So it's 1 hour per session for a level 3 station and 3 hours per session for a level 2 station. We took that position way back in 2012 because obviously we realised we were in an extremely early adopter stage. There wasn't much going on. And we decided that we didn't want to slug people that were taking a hip pocket hit by buying the vehicle in the first place, by charging them to use it. And we're also encouraging early adopters by offering that. A question that's come up recently, and again, reflecting on Peter's discussions before, and I'm not disputing that, but basically what I'm saying is that we took that position because we weren't seeing private enterprise actually stepping up to actually install this infrastructure, and essentially because the business case is very, very sketchy. And our position is that if we charge too little, we won't even recover the costs of actually the administration and the additional infrastructure to put in a payment system. And of course, if we charge too much, we'll discourage people using it, and it defeats the purpose of the exercise. So we've adopted that position. Having said that, the council did ask for a report a couple of years ago on the implications of offering this this service for free. Long story short, what they decided to do was that once our network was operating at 20% or higher of its capacity, then we'll reconsider charging to use that infrastructure. But currently, of course, still we are in early adopter stage. It's getting more use than it was 6 years ago, but we still are only operating at about 5% of the capacity of the network. So we'll continue to offer that service for free, albeit restricting the use per session. So those public stations are free to use in secure lit locations 24/7. We've also got 11 private stations for council EVs as we start to expand the EVs in the fleet. Again, this is something that Peter and Anthony reflected on in their presentations. And what about infrastructure and planning? For a long time now, the Moreland planning scheme has had encouragement for developers to actually put in or to make available the ability to put in charging infrastructure in multi-resident developments. That paragraph or that extract there in transport is an extract of the current Moreland planning scheme. And the highlighted section below is the response that one of my colleagues, an ESD engineer, gave to one of the planners where a developer was not meeting the sustainability objectives that were required in the planning scheme. And so those three options were given to that developer to encourage them to get the points required to get a planning permit. And as you can see on point 2 down there, a dedicated electric vehicle charging car park space. Basically, we see the minimum electric vehicle charging ready infrastructure as a 32 amp single phase sub-circuit to a parking space that could be dedicated to electric vehicles later on. And the council are actually always looking at ways of actually toughening that up to improve it. It's not enforceable at this stage, but it's obviously very heavily encouraged. And then, of course, for our own policy, we several years ago adopted a minimum standard sustainability policy for new council buildings. Again, the extract there comes straight from the policy, and the photo below was the first of a new development that had to adhere to that policy. And as you can see, we've got a couple of or 3 level 2 stations, one Schneider EV Link, which is 22 kilowatt capable, and one of the 7 kilowatt units. Also important to note when I show you photos of our infrastructure, all of our charging stations are tethered. We have decided to do that because in ad hoc discussions with various different regular users of our infrastructure and talking to a lot of people about their preferences, when you ask an EV owner if they turn up to an electric vehicle charging station and they're faced with a socket or a tethered station, almost 99% of them will say they'll use the tethered station because they don't have to fish around in their boot for an adapter, and maybe they don't have the adapter that they need. Obviously, we recognise that there are different socket types out there, and it's encouraging that Australian standards have adopted Type 2 and Type 2 CCS as a standard now. But of course, early adopters have been using adapters for many years and know what they need to do when they're approached with a station that's got a different tether. But we prefer to go for the tethered stations for ease. Our objective is to make it as easy as possible and to encourage people to want to go there and use it. In that particular station there, we got some good feedback on plug share. Some locals that joined the 24-hour gym that you see just behind it and go there and plug their Model S or their Model X in, go for a run around the park or actually attend the gym, and they found it very convenient. And of course, being level 2 stations, the restriction to that is 3 hours per session. And that's it for me.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for that, and thank you all three of you for your, really interesting talks. We're a little sort of short on time, so I'll jump straight into a couple of questions. I guess a few people have gone on a similar, point, which is around the selection criteria for charging station sites, and in that, whether I think Waverley and maybe others can jump in, those sites were council-owned land or private land. So maybe, Anthony, you want to go first in terms of your selection criteria for those sites, and then what happened, whether it was council-owned land or private land?
Yeah, they're all council-owned land, all our sites, except for one. One is a public-private partnership that we have with a supermarket, and the selection criteria was varied. It was safety, looking at the electricity network, distance to amenities and to services, prominence, the physical location itself, and also future use planning of what it was going to get turned into later on.
Great, thank you. I don't know if any of the other two guys had experience where it wasn't council-owned land specifically.
Well, I can say from my point of view, all of ours are on council-owned land. One interesting point, and this is something I discussed with Anthony when he was developing his criteria, we're not a big fan of on-street parking, and the reason for that is that there are a few EVs available on the Australian market that have their charging ports on the right-hand side of the car, and we consider it a safety issue to have the charging cable and nozzle protruding virtually into the roadway when it's legally charging. Of course, if it's a two-way street or even if it's a one-way street, it's illegal in terms of parking regulations to actually turn around and face the other way to actually plug in. So we found that as a bit of a barrier for on-street parking. So where our preference was to install infrastructure within council-owned car parks, which takes away all of the negotiating with landholders and peppercorn lease arrangements and bits and pieces like that. So we've concentrated specifically on council-owned land.
Great, Peter. I don't know, did you have any other experiences in terms of site selection criteria or who owns it?
I'll just agree with Stuart. Like our risk managers were very much of the same view as Moreland in terms of with bike lanes, for example, the Outlander with the charging point on the rear right. They didn't want the cable projecting into bike lanes or have anyone standing in the flow of traffic to plug in. Certainly nose to curb was important. We found that the 5 metre cable is a bit of a test with nose to curb with the appropriate setbacks for the chargers. So there's intrinsic problems that come with on street. Our preference is certainly not on street because parking politics kicks off in a big way about the car parks being immediately in front of those who maybe don't perceive the benefit for themselves. So site selection for us, we were seeking a geographic spread across the city, focused around retail and hospitality for the on-street. So in North Adelaide, it's adjacent to Melbourne Street, which is a food and small retail. In the city, we've gone Highmarsh Square and Light Square on street. And then there was the main hub that we did, which was adjacent to the Adelaide Central Markets, but really put them into our car parks in order to create the competitive tension in the marketplace to have our car park owner, which is our council owns U-Park. So we really trying to get that business to get electric vehicles into their culture and their thinking around how to sell the services to fleet owners and use it as a point of difference when they are pursuing fleet vehicles. That was also to reposition the U-Park business, which works consistent with its charter to provide parking in the city, but it is also perceived that it goes against because of the cars that it brings. So helping them to really contribute and be part of that solution. So site selection, that was big for us. Spread them around the city, but put them where the primary areas are, manage the risks. So Stuart's point, we very much went for the socket only, and we chose instead to look at it from, again, we go back a few years, a bit like Stuart, but we went socket, type 2 socket, and that was because we wanted to avoid trip hazards, but particularly malicious damage or copper hunters cutting cables or people crushing the heads of the chargers. So we're managing risks whilst making sure we made it convenient for people.
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much for that. And thank you, everyone, for presenting. We've got a few questions there. We can circulate them. There's one from Alan, which is something we can certainly answer. But thanks, everyone. Again, Charge Together, like all the councils said here, we're driving to accelerate electric vehicle adoption, obviously to decarbonise our transport sector. So, sign up if you're not already on our website, www.chargetogether.com. I'll get Alex to also paste into here a government procurement initiative led by the ACT government, City Power Partnerships. And if you haven't already, you might want to tell people when you want to, if you want to join that initiative. So, thank you again, everybody. And please do sign up. And so my name's Dan Hilson from Evenergy. And we'll sign off now. But thank you to the speakers, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Alex.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.